I'm Rob Trasinski. This is Symposium, where we talk about the ideas at the basis of a free society. My guest today is Caleb Watney, co-founder of the Institute for Progress. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on.
So what I want to talk about first, and you have the Institute for Progress, and I know you focus to some extent on policy issues, but I just want to start when we talk about studying progress and advocating for progress. I want to start just by talking about the fact of progress, because this is something that people have become to appreciate in recent years a little bit more. Steven Pinker has done a lot of work to popularize it, but I want to talk about the overwhelming, against the sort of narratives of catastrophism that we often get, the overwhelming fact of the amount of progress that we are the beneficiaries of.
Right. I think that's a great point. I think it can be pretty easy to forget, human lifespans are kind of oriented around what have you experienced, what maybe did your parents experience, maybe even what did your grandparents experience, and less about sort of, what's the 1,000+ year or, millennium long scope of human progress. And it's easy to forget that for the vast majority of human history, there was basically nothing happening. It was roving bands of hunter-gatherers, and then, agriculture started around 10,000 years ago, and kind of, out of subsistence farming came cities, and then, eventually we kind of came to the Industrial Revolution, and then we have what some people call the hockey stick of human history, where economic progress and the sort of inventing mindset kind of really came into being, and we're in a totally fundamentally different age, and it's pretty easy to forget that fact sometimes.
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of the hockey stick. I think it's more like, when you look at a graph of geometric growth, it can look very flat and then suddenly it takes off, even though it's, there's been growth happening the whole time. I remember somebody seeing a graph of the wealth of Warren Buffett over the years, and it looks like he's a guy who figured out how to make money in his mid-50s. But we realized that everything, he was making money all along before that. I think human history is a little bit like that, but we definitely have this. We're living on that outer tail of the geometric growth, where things have, especially since the Industrial Revolution, have spiked upward. And I think that what you mentioned, though, was the growth mindset and the inventing mindset. And I think that's a really important part of it, is that because, in the early part of the geometric graph, things are, maybe increasing geometrically, but over a human lifespan, or even over 100 years, things don't change all that much. 1,300 is not that much different from 1,200. And so the idea of rapid growth happening within a person's lifetime, that the world would be transforming itself over and over again, and also the idea that you as an individual could go out and be creating and inventing new things that never existed before. I think that's a big cultural change that has arisen from the Industrial Revolution, and also fed back into the process of progress.
Right. There's some, larger idea of human agency, or the ability to, fundamentally change the world kind of as an individual, that kind of was much harder to do when, 90+% of the human population was involved in subsistence agriculture. And, now the percentage of the population that's involved in agriculture is like a few percentage points, in the United States. And so the ability for humans to do things with their life other than just farming and, providing crops for their family is very different than it was, even just a few centuries ago. And it's pretty easy to forget that fact sometimes.
Yeah, and the fact of an I saw something just earlier this morning about study done about how you need an agricultural surplus to have industrialization, and the whole process of an agricultural surplus was very elusive for most of human history. And I also want to talk about how the fact that the progress that we've experienced is not just material progress, but also across a whole bunch of measures. There's moral and intellectual progress, in the sense of greater access to education, greater equality, the lifting of various artificial restrictions, so that and it may seem strange to talk about it today at this exact moment, because as we're speaking, a new war is breaking out in Europe, but the contrast of that to the previous 70 some years, where we've had what's called a long peace, that even on the issues of war and violence, we've seen that sort of moral progress.
Right. I think it can be easy to kind of get caught up in the weeds of these very abstract measures like GDP growth per capita. And while I think there are a lot of very fair criticisms of those kinds of aggregate metrics, and they miss a lot that are important, it's pretty remarkable how well they correlate with lots of other metrics that we do care about. You could create a bundle of metrics that we kind of care about, whether it's infant mortality rates, childhood nutrition, deaths from disease, women's autonomy, political rights, and who can vote, and all of these things that we sort of care about end up being sort of remarkably correlated with GDP growth per capita. And so I want to be careful in saying that GDP growth per capita is not the only thing we care about. It does miss a lot of things, like environmental amenities or other kinds of forms of sustainability that are just as important, if not more so. But it is remarkable how well they do correlate.
Right, that wealthier societies. Well, I think that's sort of a reciprocal thing, that a society that embraces certain values tends to become wealthier, and also wealthier societies can afford a lot of the things that the extra luxuries of education and things like that.
Right. I mean, having resources to spend as a society isn't, just bubbles or new cars, but it's about the ability to make different kinds of trade-offs with your time, the amount of resources that we can sort of spend as a society per person, which can be spent on healthcare and in education and in public sanitation and all these things that end up contributing to a meaningful life.
Yeah. So part of the reason that I think the focus of symposium is really on the intellectual defense of liberalism in the broadest sense of a free society. And one of the reasons I think the issue of progress is so important is that if you look at the illiberal left or the illiberal right, the various strains of illiberalism that are growing up now that are opposed to free speech or want greater government role in trying to push one agenda or another, they're often based on precisely that kind of catastrophism, the idea that, oh, the world is terrible, everything's going downhill. There's a sort of school of politics, everything was better when I was a kid. And you see it not just on the right, there were the sort of the Archie Bunker sort of style, those were the days. But also on the left was this idea, oh, back in the heyday of the labor movement, everything was so much better. But you have to have this catastrophism in order to promote the idea that therefore the whole system needs to be changed and rebuilt. So I guess my question is, the big question I want to really explore is, how would our political discourse be different? How would it change? How would the issues that we raise be different if we actually recognize that, we're not on the precipice that we're the beneficiaries of this tremendous progress?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one I sort of have mixed feelings about. I guess I certainly want to recognize the huge debt we owe in some sense to our ancestors and the people who laid the groundwork for the wealthy, prosperous society that we do have. But I think it's also the case that while we're not sort of on the certain brink of catastrophe, there are a lot of risks that we face that have kind of increased in, say, the last several decades. And I think actually COVID is sort of an example of this. Biological threats, while they're certainly not like 80% likely, we as a society have a tough time talking about risks that could be very, very bad, but only happen in a very small percentage of cases. But if something is, sufficiently bad, but even only has a 1% chance of happening, it can be worth spending a lot of resources as a society to try to prevent against that. And so I think in some ways we are maybe catastrophizing against the wrong kinds of things, but we are in some sense kind of on a precipice. There's a book called The Precipice, actually, by this guy, Toby Ord, who talks about a lot of the sort of existential risks that, again, are not very likely, but if they were to happen, would be very, very bad. And there's a lot of things that we could be doing as a society to take, common sense steps to prevent them, whether they be the risk of nuclear war, or global pandemics, or comet strikes, or any number of things. And so there is sort of an interesting tension in liberalism and in the way that people want to use sort of these calls to arm and catastrophizing as sort of, I think, a natural political impulse that is not always justified. And yet we do also face like an increased risk of certain kinds of catastrophes.
Well, I think COVID is an interesting example, though, of how, I think one of the things that's happened, especially in the last 10 years, is everything gets swallowed by the culture wars. And we
Right,
have
right.
tremendous, I mean, the big story coming out of COVID is it's the first time we've ever produced a vaccine that's safe and effective in such an amazingly short period of time. There's I refer to a principle, I think it's called McKeon's hypothesis, which basically says that by the time you develop a medical intervention, the disease will have run its course. And that's what generally happens with a pandemic, right? In the past, is that by the time you get a flu vaccine, the Spanish flu was already swept through and killed millions of people. And your interventions tend to be too late to actually stop something. This is a case where we got the jump on that to, if people would actually take the vaccine, we got a jump on it. But then what happened is that the response got all caught up in the usual political and culture wars. And I guess
Right.
that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we have a very weird and distorted way that we talk about things because of the way normal politics works.
Yeah, it is kind of unfortunate that it seems like a lot of issues have sort of been bundled together as part of this increased polarization in society. And I think part of it stems from kind of this like broader trend. Some people have called it like a vetocracy, the idea that it feels impossible to actually do things anymore. Whether that be on the individual level, you want to add, an accessory dwelling unit to your house, and your local neighborhood, commission is sort of blocking that, or on the largest level, we have a set of political institutions that were in some sense created with like 60-40 majorities in mind, and now we're kind of permanently stuck in this like 48-52 or 51-49, very small swings in public opinion in one direction or the other, which creates kind of this sense of like helplessness, or that we can't actually like do things as a society, which I think then leads to maybe like a focus on culture wars. And I wonder how that would change in some sense if we had fewer veto points, if it was easier to actually pass an agenda.
Yeah. Well, I also think how it would change if we looked at it not as, we're all doomed because China's taking away our jobs, or we're all doomed because of this, and actually had this idea that, well, what the system needs is incremental change and not tearing everything down. Because what you have right now, a lot of is, people want to tear it down, tear everything down in one way, and people who want to tear everything down in a different way. And that's why you get these sort of culture war loggerheads. But there's something you mentioned, I think, in another interview I saw, that about the idea of the secret Congress, which I think is very
Mhm.
much correct. This idea that you can actually do things in today's system so long as they don't make it onto cable TV.
Right, right, yeah. So the writer Matt Iglesias and then Simon Bazelon sort of together wrote this piece called Secret Congress, kind of fleshing out this idea in a little bit more detail. And the idea being that Congress, if you look at like, say, the number of bills passed, or what's actually like happening through the regulatory agencies, there are a surprising number of things that do happen, but they're typically the ones that are not being argued about on cable news. And that's not an accident. That is in some sense like a direct causation story, that when these issues become bundled into the ongoing culture war, and then suddenly they're being argued about on, Rachel Maddow and Tucker Carlson, that sort of activates this negative partisanship energy. And I don't mean energy in like sort of the ephemeral sense, but in like the very literal, like what are people talking about and focusing their attention on. Um, and that makes it then impossible to actually get through this sort of vetocracy system that I was talking about. The number of people who might say no to your idea when it has been bundled into this larger culture war is much larger. But we're currently on the brink of passing, hopefully, a very large science funding bill. It's gone through various names. It was originally the Endless Frontiers Act, and then it became the United States Innovation and Competition Act, and then it became the America Competes Act, and it's currently the Make It in America Act. So it's the endlessly renaming the bill act in my mind. But
It's
it
the
has,
endlessly renaming the bill after the constituency you want to get behind it. My theory
right,
is that
naturally.
eventually everything would just be called the very, very good bill that everyone should vote for act in the future. Yes.
Yes, yes, and all bills will be called that. Yeah. Um, but this bill is, it got bipartisan support in the Senate when it passed originally last summer, when it was called USICA. Um, and I think partially it didn't get a lot of attention on the news, even though it's the largest increase in science funding over the last several decades. And it's sort of grown, and it has included a lot of other things, but it hasn't really gotten a lot of mainstream attention, not a lot of, bickering debates on cable news. And I think that's part of what's allowed it to actually pass, is the fact that there's like a strong constituency amongst both Republicans and Democrats for supporting it, precisely because it is not like a very sexy topic. Increasing NSF funding is not the kind of thing that's easy to connect to sort of the cultural moods of the moment. And I think that's part of what makes it precisely possible to pass.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so one of the things I want to talk about, though, is you talked about these sort of catastrophic risks, like, an asteroid strike or pandemic. And I'm a little skeptical of the idea of, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about those things. I'm a little skeptical that we're going to be able to predict which one's going to come. But the other issue that's come up is this idea of the Great Stagnation, the idea that since roughly 1970, we've had fewer technological breakthroughs than in the period before that. Now, I throw a little skepticism at that because I think it's so hard to measure. What is the pace of innovation? What is the pace of progress? So what's the case for the idea of a great stagnation occurring? And then we'll talk about what the answer might be.
Yeah, so I'll start with the stagnation piece. So there's a number of ways you can try to get at this. I mean, one of the most simplistic is to look at total factor productivity growth, which, if you sort of think about like the economy as a whole, you could say, well, there's things we can get from throwing more capital, more financing at a problem, or there's ways in which we can increase total output by throwing more labor at something. So if we have more people, or if people are working more hours or something, those are ways of increasing output using either more capital or more labor. Total factor productivity is sort of this broad category of how do we improve output, holding those two things constant. So if we're spending the same amount of money and we're working the same amount of hours, there's ways in which we can get more output from the same number of inputs. And that can be through better technology, through better institutions, better organizational management structures or philosophies. And
so for example, for example, you reorganize your factory into an assembly line, and suddenly with the same number of people, the same amount of materials, you can make more pins. Take the famous example anyway, take the famous example of the pin factory. Yeah.
Right. So there's any number of things that we can do to sort of improve our productive capacity using the same number of inputs to get more outputs. And we call that broad bundle TFP. And so if you look at total factor productivity growth, over the last 60 years, basically since the 1970s, it's actually been in a period of decline when compared to, say, the period of 1880 to 1970, where it was much higher. And so we sort of saw a brief revival of TFP growth in sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, with maybe like sort of the internet era and some of the productivity improvements that came from that. But it again been slowing since then.
And then we had the social media era, and everybody's on Twitter, and productivity went down.
Right. Yeah. So that's sort of a very like abstract way of thinking about the Great Stagnation. Maybe a more illustrative example. There's a thought experiment that if you were to have been alive in, say, the 1900, and then you were to wake up in 1950, 1960, and you saw how dramatically the world had changed around you. Suddenly there are skyscrapers in every major city. Suddenly you have indoor plumbing. Suddenly you have refrigerators and ovens and washing machines and cars and the very physical structure of the world that you lived in would have been almost unrecognizable over this 60-year span. And if you were to do a similar thought experiment between, say, 1960, 1970, and today, the world would actually not look that different, with sort of the big exception of smartphones and the information revolution. And so that sort of like leads to this question of basically, has the smartphone revolution been enough to make up for all those huge changes we saw in the very physical built environment of the world? And I think it's fair to say that sort of, obviously smartphones and the information revolution have been enormously impactful, and we spend a lot of our time on there. But like the period before 1970 had almost revolutions as significant as the smartphone happening in 6 different areas, and today we only have had them in really one area. And so again, I don't want to downplay the importance of the smartphone, but that's another way of sort of thinking about what has happened in the Great Stagnation.
Well, I see the point of that. I mean, the usual statement about this is something like, the best minds of our generation are at work at trying to get people to click on more ads. Or they're off, or even worse, they're off coining NFTs, which, as far as I can tell, is an activity that produces no actual value whatsoever, but can be very lucrative because there's a sucker born every minute. But that there's a sort of like digital make work kind of jobs that are not really changing our normal lives in that serious of a way.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could think about previous eras where, like the top minds of our generation were involved in the Manhattan Project or the Apollo program, or, pushing out the frontiers of science in various ways. And we still have a lot of, great work happening in science, but I think the fraction of our maybe society's greatest minds that are going to do its problems is less than it might have been in the past. And you can also see this in other ways. There's a great paper by my friends, Ben Southwood and Tyler Cowan, that looks at the rate of scientific advancement across these periods, and also shows that there's sort of been a slowdown in the number of new scientific advancements happening. You can see this generally in like demographic trends that, it seems like society is generally getting older, more risk averse. We're taking fewer risks. We're starting fewer new businesses. So across a wide number of ways, society has kind of grown more complacent. And less sort of the need for progress has grown less urgent over the last 70 years.
So let's use that as a pivot to go into talking about what. So, and I gather this is more the focus of the Institute for Progress, is what are the policy solutions that we can do to help improve that? So, for example, you say the population is getting older and less risk averse. I know one of the things you advocate, which I totally agree with, is making it easier especially for science and people with backgrounds in science and technology, making it easier for immigrants to come here and start new businesses and create new ideas.
Right. So progress, I think, to really get like an increased focus on progress as a society requires a lot of things, of which policy is just one aspect, but it's the aspect that my co-founder and I are choosing to focus on, partially as sort of like a specialization and comparative advantage. We've sort of been in the DC ecosystem for a while, but I think also policy is maybe the single most important bottleneck at this point. Like, it would be great if we could have a culture that was more pro-progress, but that seems much harder to change versus policy. I think we have more, a clearly delineated set of institutional bottlenecks that we can hopefully change. And we also think that while culture is in some sense upstream of policy and politics, there's also ways in which it's downstream, and we can make policy changes that might have downstream consequences on culture. So all that is, I think, in a lot of ways tied. But yeah, we are focusing to begin with on sort of three key areas, hoping to expand over time, but to sort of focus our efforts. Originally, we're trying to focus on issues that we think are a combination of, we're sort of using this framework of what is significant, what would actually really matter if you were to change it? What is tractable? Do we think that it is possible to actually make change or productive, dialogue on these issues? And then what is neglected? That if you're focusing on an issue that everybody else is focusing on, your sort of marginal contribution is going to be lower. But if you can focus on really important and tractable things that don't have a lot of attention, the combination of those three factors is where your energy can be best spent. And so using that kind of framework, we've decided on these three initial areas. The first is meta science, or the science of science. Basically, how do we change the funding structures, the organizational models, and the incentives within sort of especially the federal funding of science to get more breakthroughs, to be funding younger scholars, we like the phrase, the economist Pierre Azerlay said, we need to turn the scientific method on ourselves, and basically applied scientific method to the way that we fund science. And so that's sort of bucket number one. Bucket number two, as you mentioned, is immigration, with a special focus on high-skilled immigration. How can we help more scientists, engineers, mathematicians, supply chain managers, come to the United States and help us, restart growth, start new businesses. And we think that is especially maybe the highest value thing that we can be doing. And it's surprisingly neglected. We can get into that more later if you're interested. And then the third issue is sort of this issue of biosecurity, which we both think of as how do we prevent future pandemics. COVID, by some very conservative estimates, cost the US economy around $16 trillion in both lost output and, people that had injuries or died from COVID. And so preventing future pandemics is very important. And also the pandemic sort of revealed maybe some low-hanging fruit in the field of biology that is waiting to be picked. And so take something like mRNA vaccines, for example. I think it's quite plausible you could have had mRNA vaccines a whole decade earlier. They were sitting on the proverbial shelf if we had sort of a similar burst of urgency in funding and regulatory streamlining. And so what else is sort of waiting on the proverbial shelf to be unlocked?
Yeah, the mRNA vaccines are interesting because I remember you just recently reading about one of the people who developed the mRNA vaccines, who was basically, downgraded at her university and basically told, "Oh, we think the research you're doing isn't productive. We think you should stop doing it," and basically told this is a dead end. It's ridiculous that you're working on this right before it became something that changed the world and changed how we even make vaccines. And I think that goes with one of the issues of the science funding, which is that, one of the dangers of, when the government comes in to fund science, one of the dangers of it is always, well, how do they know who to fund, who's doing good research and who's not? Well, you go to the establishment and you go to the scientific establishment, and, you have that danger of groupthink in the scientific establishment. I know one of the big stories is how Alzheimer's research basically got shunted off onto the wrong path for about 20 years because they had an initial theory of how it was going to work. And that became the establishment theory, and all the funding went into that. And then it turned out to be a dead end, and you're sort of starting over again now. So how do you deal with that issue of having, it's sort of, I think, partly the inherent danger of having government come in to be the leader in scientific research funding is that it does it in this bureaucratic way and tends to fall into that danger of groupthink. So how do you get around that? How do you come up with mechanisms to allow for more diversity and more creativity?
Right. I think there's a number of things you could try to do, but I first want to say I think that these dangers sort of groupthink and bureaucratism aren't unique just to government funding. These can also show up in private research institutions as well. I mean, a lot of our top research institutions are themselves private universities that sometimes receive government funding, but also have very large endowments, and they tend to be funding also very old established university professors. And so I think this is sort of like a larger societal phenomenon that we have to find ways to combat. But one way in which we've been suggesting, and we have put out a recent paper on this, is the idea of a scientific lottery. And so you would take some subset of very well qualified proposals that end up going through the sort of review process and are deemed to be good proposals but don't ultimately receive funding, and then you enter those sort of the people who didn't win into a lottery, and you pick some subset of them randomly, and then you fund them, and you see sort of what's the difference between these proposals that are funded randomly versus go through this very long arduous review process. And I think the hope is that you might reveal things, you might generate more data about how healthy is this ecosystem currently. What I would suspect is that, especially when you account for the very large bureaucratization costs of the current system, which by some metrics, is costing 44% of the time of principal investigators is being spent doing grant paperwork and related, maintenance, rather than actually doing active research. That once you account for those costs, just issuing grants randomly, subject to some basic quality filter, you might end up getting just as good results. And so we're suggesting a pilot program to sort of test this out and hopefully generate more data. One example that I sometimes use, or an analogy, in the international development context, there was for a long time a lot of debate or discussion around what is the most effective way to give to people in need, especially in developing countries. Should we build them new schools? Should we give them textbooks? Should we try to help with provision of food? Should we do anti-malarial bed nets, deworming pills, give them farm animals, and any number of different kinds of interventions? But it's pretty hard to compare across those different metrics or those different interventions until we had a baseline that we could compare them to. And so a group of economists, Chris Blattman, as well as a bunch of other great scholars, came in and did these sort of randomized control trials using cash grants as sort of a comparison. And they found that while there are some things that are more effective than just giving cash, there are a lot of things that are not as effective as just giving cash directly to poor people in the developing world. And so I would suspect that a sort of similar thing is true of science funding, that there are ways of distributing grants that are better than just doing it randomly, but that there are a lot of ways, maybe including our current system, that are less effective than just giving cash, through a lottery. And so, but having that sort of baseline that you can compare to might end up raising the bar for the entire enterprise. At least that's the hope.
One of the things is I talked to some I know a guy who the guy behind Boom Aerospace, who's trying to work on a supersonic jet, which is exactly the sort of thing that we're talking about, where he came out of Silicon Valley doing the usual Silicon Valley things, and now is working on something that would actually make air travel much faster. And one of the things that he was talking about is that the big thing he thought that Silicon Valley had learned over and above, the actual specific things it did, is it learned how to create a business, how to start up, and how to create a lot of startups and put money into a whole bunch of different ideas, and this sort of venture capital mindset where you are actually trying you don't have a central, you don't have a bunch of people sitting in a conference room and deciding, we're going to figure out what the next, 5 biggest business ideas are. It was more like, we're going to go out and we're going to try a whole bunch of stuff. We're going to do a whole bunch of startups, and then we will find out, sometimes unexpectedly, what the next big business idea is. And so that idea of having more sort of a hothouse venture capital kind of sort of mindset of, we're going to try a whole bunch of stuff. Some of it's going to fail, but we're going to have these, the market will show us, or the results will show us what turns out to be the next big idea. And it won't necessarily be, what you could have predicted ahead of time.
Right. And oftentimes, you have scientific research projects that are focused in one area and then end up having unexpected benefits in another. I mean, penicillin, the invention of penicillin was not intended as sort of an original, medical intervention. I think he was studying like algae and fungi, and it ended up turning out that he discovered penicillin, and that ended up being, one of the biggest advancements in public health in recent history. And so, yeah, it's sort of this idea of like basic research funding that you should let sort of this process maybe be driven by curiosity-driven science of individual research professors sort of driving down a particular pathway. It's very difficult to anticipate what will be the spillovers of that research in 30 plus years. But I think in general, we should be trying to think about our science funding as sort of a portfolio, to use a venture capital model. And we have some funding that's sort of this very curiosity-driven basic research that might end up having spillovers 30 years down the road, but we could never predict beforehand. There's other times when we have a very specific technical problem that we're trying to solve, and you need to take high risk, high reward, opportunities to fund those sort of risky ventures. I think part of this is also maybe trying out or experimenting with different kinds of organizational models. There are some tasks that are very well suited for traditional university-based research labs, but there's a lot of other tasks that are not well suited for that. And so one organizational model I'd love us to maybe experiment with is an idea called focused research organizations. And the idea is that there's sort of this space in between, say, when it's too late in the process for it to be an academic publication, it's too applied to really make sense to publish, but it's still too early in the process for venture capitalists to be willing to take a bet on something, because the technology is just not far enough along. And so you could fund sort of this intermediate organization that would have public funding, but a very flexible startup-like organizational model. And they would have a very discrete, say, 7-year period to try to make technical progress in a specific area. And then hopefully sort of the fruits of that could spill over and lead to startups down the road, but trying to find ways of filling that gap.
Yeah. Now, immigration, one of the other issues mentioned is one where I really think there's this sort of chicken and egg thing where the catastrophism of thinking everything's going downhill sort of interferes with the ability to create more progress that might lift people out of the catastrophism, because the immigration is one of those issues that sort of hits people in the fear center, where it's like, oh, well, these other people are going to be coming in and taking our jobs, and it's this very sort of fixed, there's a fixed pie and somebody else is going to be nibbling at it kind of mindset instead of a growth mindset. So what do you recommend in terms of how to approach that, both in terms of the policy and in terms of the politics of overcoming that, the catastrophism that prevents you from having a pro-progress approach?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem, but I think you sort of hit on the interesting loop of, when you're in a zero-sum mentality, it's then harder for you to undertake the policies that would get you out of that zero-sum mentality in the first place. But that when you're sort of in it, when everyone can see that the pie is growing and benefiting them, it's easier for them to sort of take this positive sum mindset and take on more risks as a society that might lead to future growth. In terms of immigration specifically, I think we have a few ideas. While we are generally in favor of immigration of all types, and we think immigration has been a huge boon for the United States, we're choosing to focus specifically on sort of the subset of highly skilled, highly technical sort of STEM type immigrants, for a few reasons. One, we think it's maybe the most likely to actually change in the next couple of years. There's some tentative Republican interest in actually getting some improvements to high skilled immigration, and so we want to take sort of wins where we can. But there's also another factor here, which is that sort of American perceptions of who is coming into the country or what is the average contribution of immigrants are shaped by the kinds of immigration that we have. And if you look at other countries, sort of other, especially Western industrialized societies that have more immigrants per capita than us, they also tend to have a different mix of immigrants that tend to be more focused on skills or employment-based immigration as opposed to, say, family and family reunification. And again, I think family reunification immigration is really great and very worthwhile. And refugee policy is a huge humanitarian win for us. But in some sense, you have to be able to show the rest of the population that immigration does benefit them. And I think that's most obvious. And it seems to be empirically the most obvious for citizens. Canada, Australia, the UK all have higher levels of support for immigration than the United States. They have more immigrants per capita than we do, and they have they have a different skill mix that tends to lean more towards employment-based and skilled immigration.
Yeah, I think I mean, one of the most insane things in that policy things that we've done in the last 50 years, 30 years is to say, we're going to make it very difficult for the smartest people in the world to come here and live in this country. And we have one of the great university systems in the world, and we have all these PhDs and educated people from around the world coming out of our schools, and then having to jump through so many hoops to be able to stay here and work here and bring those productive efforts here.
Right. And I mean, the United States has historically, been able to be a superpower in science and technology because of our focus on immigration. If you look across our history, especially across the 20th century, we had several waves of sort of skilled immigration that ended up contributing a lot to U.S. science and technology. You sort of the influx of Jewish refugees that were fleeing, Germany, which included, Albert Einstein and a lot of the great minds that formed the basis of the Manhattan Project.
One of the things I always think about is whenever it says we need a Manhattan Project for such and such, I think, well, look at the guys in the Manhattan Project. Where were they from? Were they a bunch of Americans? It was, like you said, a bunch of German and Hungarian Jews and various refugees and immigrants, a huge number of them coming there because the real insanity of Nazism is that, he chased out all the people who are going to develop, the greatest, who are going to develop the weapons that would then have just, if he had lasted that long, have destroyed him. But this idea that we benefited from all the chaos in the rest of the world, we benefited from it by having all the best and smartest people come here, and if we want to have the new Manhattan projects for whatever goal you want to achieve, you need to have those immigrants to power it.
Right. And it's a very topical example, given what's happening in the news. As the Soviet Union was sort of declining in the 90s, there was another wave of talent from Russia to the United States, especially in the form of a lot of top mathematicians. And as they came here, there were a lot of reports about they were replenishing the mathematical juices of the United States, as one top university professor put it. And it was a huge influx of talent. And if you look at, say, something like the Nobel Prize in physics as just a one proxy for sort of United States contributions to science. If you look in the period, it started in like 1900, 1901. So between that period and say 1930, 1940, we won around, or we were involved in roughly like I think it was 1 in 3 prizes. There was like an American involved. If you look at the period since then, it's about 2/3. So like our relative contributions to physics have increased dramatically because of sort of a strong immigrant base in the United States.
Yeah. So the other aspect, though, I want to talk a little bit about the cultural aspect. I know that's not as much your focus, but I know that's part of what you're up against here. And I think it's not just the idea of the fear and the sort of zero-sum mentality that you're dealing with, but also I mentioned earlier the complaint that our best minds of our generation are of the new generation are focused on how to click on ads. But I also think there's, in the universities, there's a problem with the culture in the universities that the best minds are focused on arguing about whether or not you should use pronouns in your bio, right? So that the culture, like I said, the culture war, especially in the last 10 years, has come and eaten everything. I mean, one of the things that I think of in that respect is sort of one of the things that inaugurated the current round of the culture wars was that they had this European team that landed a probe on a comet. And the big news that came out of it was there's a controversy about one of the scientists on it was wearing a shirt that was deemed sexist. And the way the culture wars have eaten everything is taking this enormous amount of mental energy and also sort of spiritual energy. The idea, if you're looking for something that will give meaning and purpose to your life, there's a lot of people feeding to you that, politics and the culture war will give meaning and purpose to your life, and not, let's build the future and let's create this science fiction future that we've been dreaming of.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a difficult issue. It's partially hard because oftentimes these sort of cultural movements are responding to, very serious inequities from the past. And so sometimes these, corrections can end up being a very positive force in society. But I think the larger issue there is sort of this problem of maybe a scarcity mindset, or what leads to sort of increased focus on cultural violations, the term that I think Derek Thompson at The Atlantic has coined around focusing on an abundance agenda, rather than arguing around should we be wearing masks in school, or should we be testing or whatnot. If you just had like an abundance of those things, it would lead to there's so many fights in the early days of the pandemic around like, oh, should you mask or should you save them for nurses and people. Of the housing discussions now, people feel like it's impossible for them to build wealth or to live in the places they want to live, because we have an artificial scarcity of housing. I think even in the university context, there's a lot of fighting around who can get into the top Ivy League colleges, and what's the difference between affirmative action versus legacy admits or something. But we're not building new universities. The last big university in the sort of the University of California system, it was, I think, 50, 60 years ago. We're not building new institutions and the abundance that we actually need to achieve the progress we want.
Oh yeah. So one of the things you mentioned there was housing, and I think that's an interesting example because it's one of these very subtle things that that we haven't really built housing in a way that's adequate to keep up the population. There's a lot of NIMBYism, there's a lot of regulation, and that focuses on the various things in which government regulations have sort of bogged down the amount of progress. And housing has a lot of particular interesting effects, like it keeps people, if you want to move to San Francisco to be part of the big tech boom in San Francisco, housing is so prohibitively expensive that a lot of people aren't going to be able to move there and participate in it. So let's talk about it a little bit. To what extent are you focusing on the ways in which government regulations and government controls and this sort of oftentimes a top-down mentality have created this veto power that you have in the system that prevents things from being done?
Right. Yeah, it's tricky. And I think housing is maybe like a good example or thing to work through as we think about these veto points. And while housing is not one of our initial three areas, it is something that we would like to sort of, expand into. I'd say it's probably issue, 4 or 5 is sort of, underrated solutions to climate change, and then sort of some of these urbanism, housing, transportation, construction type issues. So yeah, it's certainly something that's on our radar and we're hoping to do more work on. But I think the sort of the focus on very decentralized neighborhood advisory committees, or sort of these, city by city zoning decisions, was something that was created out of a lot of the excesses of, you could say, like, the Robert Moses era in New York City. He was just like bulldozing through, primarily African-American communities to construct new highways, and that caused a lot of harm. And so then in our effort to basically say this will never happen again, we created a bunch of veto points. And now it's unfortunate that those veto points are basically being wielded by white wealthy landowners in suburban areas who don't want to see new people come into their neighborhoods. And so there is sort of, this perverse effect of sometimes we can try to create veto points to prevent certain kinds of harms, and then it can end up perpetuating those harms. And so I think for the housing issue specifically, there's sort of an interesting way in which either pushing the sort of zoning decision either up further to maybe the state level, where there's sort of a greater recognition of the fact that it's sort of the NIMBY movement, not my backyard, sort of comes from a very literal, like, oh, I want to see housing built, I just don't want it in my neighborhood. And so if we decide those decisions at the state level, it sort of takes away some of the concern around, oh, what's happening in my specific neighborhood, and we can focus on these broader goals if we do want more housing to be built. So we need to actually take the steps to do that. So pushing it up to the state level is one way of doing that. Or I'm also intrigued by this idea of street voting that our friend John Myers in the UK has sort of pioneered, that basically you could have a block by block or street by street voting to decide what do you want the zoning to look like on your individual street. And that's almost so local that you could actually begin to imagine some of the benefits and say increasing your land value if your city were rezoned, that it can actually create buy-in for those kinds of decisions. So I think we're sort of at like a very inoptimal median. And so either pushing more local or higher up to the state level would be probably a positive mood.
Well, see, the idea of that super local one is that my house, instead of being afraid my house is going to go down 10% because they built a high rise 2 streets away, you can think, oh, my house will go up in value because somebody will want to buy it to build a high rise on my property. So it changes the economic incentives. Yeah. And now the NIMBYism and the sort of the new movement they call YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, the pro-development, anti-restrictive zoning, sort of what's it they call the pulling up the moat mentality, right? Where you've moved into the city and then you put a moat around it and say nobody else can come.
Right.
The fact that there's a YIMBY movement, I think, is kind of interesting too for another perspective, which is it shows the possibility of creating sort of coalitions that are outside of the normal political alignments that we have. And that's something I've really been wanting to explore a lot here at Symposium, which is the idea of how can we have sort of a realignment in the way that we think of it, and how can we have, classical liberals like me making common cause with maybe center left liberals, and YIMBYism is like one of the few examples I can see where that's actually happening in a significant way. So that's, I think, part of what I want to talk about is the possibility of sort of getting out of the old left versus right alignments, which often have very accidental alignments of policies, and building new political coalitions that can maybe break some of these veto powers and log jams.
Right. I like the formulation of transpartisanship as opposed to bipartisanship. And so you could sort of think about this as bipartisanship is when you have two sides that are sort of mutually compromising and ending up in like sort of a mushy middle that neither side is particularly happy about. Versus transpartisanship is sort of the idea that both sides can support the same thing, but for different reasons. And so I think the U.S. science funding bill I was talking about earlier is actually an example of this. Republicans are sort of getting on board with the idea that we want to maintain U.S. leadership over China in a lot of these key technology areas, and this is an issue of national defense. When
they renamed it the Make It in America Act or something like that, that's transparently to appeal to Republican votes, right?
Absolutely. Versus, Democrats are sort of being sold on this idea that this is, public investment in our public universities, and this is, believing scientists and supporting scientists, and sort of it's a different set of reasons to be supporting the same piece of legislation. And so, I think in the zoning context, this sort of plays out. You can tell Republicans this is deregulation and this will spur economic growth, and you can tell Democrats that this is like actually how we create housing for a lot of poor people or for people that would like to move to an area. And so this is a way of creating new economic opportunity or creating new ladders for mobility within American society. And so I think, there's a lot of promise for these sorts of issues when you can frame them in transpartisan ways. If you can actually build real constituencies on both sides of the aisle for these ideas. And I also want to make a note that I think it's sometimes easier to just like mobilize one side or the other because you can play into these sort of tribal identities. But it's really worth taking the extra time and the extra effort and attention to try to build a transpartisan coalition on these issues, because oftentimes the point of change is to not just change it at any one point of time, but to have it permanently changed. And it would be, for a lot of these issues, sort of the ongoing support is key to their success. It would be very unfortunate if we only got, large pandemic preparation funding, during Republican or Democratic administrations. You need to happen under both. And so, there's issues like that, or science funding, or, zoning decisions, that it would be very bad if we were constantly flip-flopping between different administrations, or the roughly 50% of the time you would expect your preferred political party to be out of power. And so even though it takes more effort and it's harder and you have to be maybe slightly more selective about your issues, it's really worth trying to build that.
Yeah, the even more interesting part of this sort of transpartisanship that I see also is not just that people will support the same thing for different reasons, but that they might also listen to each other's reasons a little bit more. That, people from the left, instead of reflexively dismissing anything that you say that there's too much regulation, would say, okay, yes, I will look at the idea that maybe excessive regulations can get in the way of opportunity, And people on the right, instead of, I think that, one of the things that's happened with housing policy and things like that is that anything that goes on in the big cities, where people vote for Democrats, we don't care about it because, we care about the real America in the heartland. And so actually, there was a push about, back in the Romney era, sort of about 8 or 10 years ago, there was a push to say, oh, we should be reaching out to constituencies in the inner cities. We should care about their concerns. And that was kind of swept aside. But I think that was a good approach to take, to say, some of these concerns about how can we improve life for people who have not traditionally voted for us, that could become, you could take that more seriously. If we, and that transpartisanship can actually get people not just to temporary alliances of convenience, but actually listening to each other and taking into account different concerns that they're normally blocked from doing by these sort of tribal or ideological alignments that come from previous eras.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. Trying to find ways to make points in ways that have people rethink their traditional priors is always very important. And I think it also maybe gets at the way in which humans actually change their mind isn't from having some knockdown argument presented from you, in one cool rational debate. It's sort of an accumulation of examples or situations that you sort of have to think about in different contexts, and then over time you sort of draw more connections. But yeah, changing your mind is a very slow process that happens over the course of many different examples and not something that happens all at once. And so creating more times for people to have their priors challenged is always good.
Great. So where can we go to find out more about what you're doing with the Institute for Progress?
Right. Yeah. So you can follow all of our stuff on our website, which is progress.institute. We're also very active on Twitter. I'm at Caleb Watney, and my co-founder Alec is at Alex Stapp. Or you can follow our institutional account at IFP. And so those are the places where we're probably most active. We also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to on our website.
Well, I follow both of you, so I get to see everything you're doing there. And the big thing and that I want to conclude with is that what I enjoy is this sort of conversation we're having right now. And that's what I mean by how would the discourse change if we were focused on progress instead of focusing on the catastrophism. That, I think there's a much more interesting and profound and more positive political discussion to be had if we're not focused on, how is my team going to win out over your team in this battle where, the fate of the entire world it hangs on the latest, minor piece of legislation, and instead had more the approach of how can we, what should we be doing to build a newer and better future. So I want to thank you for coming on to talk about that and help steer the discussion in that direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it was great to chat with you, and definitely happy to continue this conversation. And anyone who wants to get involved, definitely engage with our work, and hopefully we can make this conversation even wider.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on. I'm Rob Trzynski. This is Symposium. Our guest today has been Caleb Watney of the Institute for Progress. For more discussions like this, go to symposium.substack.com. And you can also like this YouTube video if you're watching it on video, which helps us get this message out to more people. Thank you for joining the conversation.